Hello, reading room. We are here working on our story, our classic story, Heidi. We're about 3/4 of the way through. Oh, sorry. I put some pistachios in my mouth. They were delicious. Fresh. They taste really fresh. Winter in Dorfley. The snow lay piled up about the elm hut so that it looked as if the windows touched the ground. Below them, nothing of the building was visible, and the house door had quite disappeared. If the elm uncle had been living there, he would have had to do as Peter did, for it snowed hard almost every night. Peter jumped out of the bedroom window into the snow, where he was obliged to fight his way along through the drifts with might and main, using his hands and feet as often his head. His mother handed him the broom from the window, and he brushed and shoved with that until he reached the house door. He had to clear away the heavy snow piled up against it, or it would fall in and half fill the kitchen should anyone try to enter. Moreover, if the snow were allowed to freeze hard, then no one could get in or out, and the inmates would be imprisoned. When once it froze hard, however, Peter had an easy and pleasant time of it. If he had to go down to Dorfley, he could creep out of the window and let himself down onto the crust. Then his mother would give him his little sledge through the same opening, and he would seat himself on him and go off when and where he chose, for all ways led downward. The entire elm was an unbroken coast. But the uncle was not on the elm this winter. He had kept his promise. As soon as the first snow began to fall, he closed the hut and the stalls and went with Heidi and the goats down to Dorfley. Near the church and the parsonage stood an old ruined building which plainly had once been a spacious mansion. Many of the rooms were in pretty good condition still, though some of the walls had fallen wholly, some in part. The former owner was a brave soldier who had served in the Spanish wars, had performed many deeds of valor, and accumulated great wealth. He came back to his native village in Dorfley, built his big, handsome house, and tried to live there, but the attempt did not last long. Little Dorfley was too peaceful and dull after the stirring life he had led in the great world. He went away and never returned. Many years after, when it was quite certain that he was dead, a distant relation took possession of the house, but not before it had fallen completely into ruin to be worth repairing. Only quite poor families, therefore, lived in it, who paid little for the privilege, and when a wall fell in or out, here or there, left it as it had fallen. But this was many years ago. When the elm uncle came first to Dorfley, he had occupied the decayed old house with his son Tobias. Since that time, it had stood empty, for unless one knew how to prop up the falling walls and mend the windows and stop the holes and rents as they occurred, it was not really habitable. In Dorfley especially, the winter was long and cold. The wind blew howling through the rooms from every side. The lights were extinguished, and the dwelling in the old house shivered and shook with cold and discomfort. No danger of that for the uncle, however. He knew how to make himself comfortable. He took the old house again as soon as he had decided to go down to the village, and though the autumn months went constantly to put it in order and make it weatherproof, In the middle of October, he moved down there with Heidi. If one approached the house from the rear, one entered an open space where the wall had fallen in one side utterly, while half of the other was left standing. The bow window, whose glass had long since disappeared, was still to be seen mantled with thick ivy to the roof, whose fine arches showed that there had been a chapel. Between this and the great wall adjoining, the door was quite broken away, but remains of a handsome stone pavement were visible, between which the grass grew high and rank. Here, too, the walls had fallen in part, as well as a portion of the roof, roof, the remainder of which, save for a few thick columns, seemed about to fall upon the head of whoever might be beneath it. Here the uncle had made a partition of boards and covered the floor with straw for a lodging for his goats. I just want to see, if we're on. Then there were numerous passages where sometimes the sky above was visible and sometimes the green fields without and the road. Beyond all this, there was a room with a strong oaken door hanging firmly on its hinges, a fine large room in good condition, its dark panelings of oak quite unbroken. In a corner stood a huge stove, reaching almost to the ceiling, on whose white tiles blue pictures were painted. There were old towers surrounded by high trees, under which stood a hunter with his dogs, and there was a quiet lake under wide shadowing oaks, where a fisherman stretched his rod far over the water. Round the whole stove there was a seat built so that one could sit at ease to examine the pictures. This pleased Heidi exceedingly. As soon as she entered this room with her grandfather, she ran towards the stove and seated herself to study the pictures. As she slid along the bench, she at last came quite behind the stove, and a new object of interest met her eyes. Between the stove and the wall was a quite wide space, and there was a rack that looked as if meant for drying apples. No apples were there, however, but Heidi's bed, exactly as it was on the elm, a high pile of hay with the sheet well tucked in all around, and the sack for coverlid. Heidi shouted aloud, "Oh, grandfather, this must be my bedroom. How beautiful! But where is yours? Where will you sleep? Your bed must be near the stove where you will not feel the cold. You may come to see mine." The child danced through the long room behind the grandfather, who opened a door at the other end and showed a small room where his bed was placed. Another door led out from this room. With curiosity, Heidi opened the door and stood still in surprise. Before her was a large kitchen, so large that she did not know what to think of it. The grandfather had had a deal of work to make this room habitable, and there still remained much to be done. There were holes and big cracks on every side where the wind came in, and yet so many had been already stopped with boards and planks that the room looked as if the little cupboards had been fastened to the walls everywhere. The big old door had been made fast with nails and wires and could now be shut securely, which was a good thing, for beyond were only fallen walls, between which grew thick shrubs and bushes, where armies of lizards and insects of all sorts harbored. Heidi was delighted with her new dwelling, and when Peter came to see her the next day to inquire how they were getting on, she had searched and peeped into all the corners and out-of-the-way places so thoroughly that she was perfectly at home and could show him all about the premises. The child slept famously in her corner behind the stove, but every morning on awakening she thought herself on the elm and felt she must rush to the hut door to see if the pines were not singing, while the deep snow was piled thereon and weighed down the branches. She had to look about her for a long time to find out where she was, and had always a choking and stifling feeling when she realized that she was not at her home on the Alp. But when she presently heard her grandfather's voice talking to the goats, and heard them bleating heartily as if they said, "Come out, Heidi, make haste and come out," then she knew where she was, and sprang up and dressed as quickly as possible to run into the spacious court where the stalls were. On the fourth day, however, she announced that she must go to see grandmother, who ought not to be left alone so long. To this her grandfather did not agree. "Neither today nor tomorrow," he said. "The elm lies deep in snow, and it is still snowing there. If sturdy Peter can scarcely work his way through, a little one like my Heidi, a little one like my Heidi would be snowed up on the spot, quite hidden, and never more to be found. Wait a while till it freezes. Then you can walk up on the crust." It troubled Heidi a good deal that she could not go at once. Yet the days were so filled with all sorts of work now that unawares one was gone and another came. Every morning and every afternoon she went to school and learned eagerly all that was to be learned there. Peter said scarcely Peter she scarcely saw in the school, however, for he was rarely there. The teacher, a mild sort of man, only said now and then, "It seems to me that Peter is missing again today. He can't afford to lose his schooling, but there is a good deal of snow up his way, and he probably cannot get through." Toward evening, when school was over, Peter came through well enough and paid his visit to Heidi very regularly. After a few days, the sun shone again and cast his beams over the fields of snow, sinking soon behind the mountain, however, as if it did not delight him to see the earth without its grass and leaves and flowers. The moon, however, rose large and clear and shone the whole night through, and in the morning the whole Alp, from top to bottom, sparkled and glistened like crystal. When Peter opened his window the same morning to get into the snow as usual, it did not feel at all as he expected. Instead of sinking in the floundering about as he had done before, plump he came on the hard crust. Away he flew like a sled without a master, and only after much effort regained his feet and began stamping violently to assure himself that the crust was really strong. He tried to drive his heel in, but only splintered off a tiny bit of the icy surface. The whole elm was frozen as hard as a rock. Peter knew well that only under such conditions Heidi could come up to the cottage, and he was content. Quickly he gulped down his milk when he had entered the cottage again, stuffed his beard into his pocket, and said hurriedly, "Now I must go to school." "Yes, go and study hard," said his mother encouragingly. Out of the window crept Peter again, for the door was fast. He drew his little sledge after him, and down he shot like a rocket over the crust. He flew along so fast that when he came to Dorfli, where the descent continues down to Mayenfeld, he still went on, for it seemed to him that he must exert great force over himself and his sledge if he wanted to stop in his course. But on he went until he came down to the plain where the sledge stopped of itself. He got off and looked about him. He had been carried even beyond Mayenfeld. Now it occurred to him that school must have begun some time ago, and that it would be over before he could get up there, as it would take him a full hour to climb the hill again. So he took his time to return, and so it was that he reached Dorfli just as Heidi had got home from school and was sitting down to dinner with their grandfather. Peter went in, and having a big thought to express, which lay very near the surface, he got rid of it as soon as he entered. "We've got it," he said, standing in the doorway. What? General, that sounds very warlike," said the uncle. "The crust," replied the lad. Oh, now I can go up to the grandmother," said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood Peter's meaning at once. "But why did you not come to school, Peter? You could have come down well enough on your sled," she added reproachfully, for it seemed wrong to her that he should have stayed away when there was no need. "Came down too far on the sled. 'Twas too late," returned Peter. That is called deserting," said the uncle, "and when men do that, they must be taken by the ear. Do you understand?" Peter covered his ears with his hands in great fright, for if there was anybody in the world whom he feared especially, it was the elm uncle. "And you an officer into the bargain?" said the uncle further. "It is twice as bad for you to run away from this fashion. What would you think if your goats were to run away, one here and one there, and take it into their heads not to follow or obey you any more? What would you do then?" "Beat them," was the laconic reply. "And if a boy did the same thing, like an unherded goat, and should get beaten a little, what would you say then?" "Served him right," was the answer. "So now you know what you deserve, Goat General. The next time you go sliding down below the valley, instead of stopping at the school, just come in here and I will give it to you." Now at last Peter understood the drift of the conversation, and that uncle meant him when he spoke of a lad who ran away like an unherded goat. And then the uncle meant him, right? He was quite struck by the comparison and stood staring into the corner as if he saw something lying there, such as he could use in like circumstances for the goats. There's our picture. Let's do this. But the uncle mounted quite pleasantly. But the uncle resumed quite pleasantly. Come now, sit down to the table with us, and Heidi shall then go up with you. Peter was delighted at this most unexpected turn of affairs, and twisted his face into all sorts of grimaces to express his pleasure. He obeyed without hesitation, and seated himself near Heidi, who, however, had soon finished her dinner. She was so glad to go at last to see the grandmother that she could not eat. She gave her potato and toasted cheese to Peter, who had already received a plateful from the uncle, and so had a formidable pile before him. His courage did not fail him, however, and he advanced valiantly to the attack. Heidi ran to the press to fetch her a new warm mantle which Clara had sent her. Now she could make the journey with the hood over her ears and be perfectly warm. She seated herself again by the lad's side, saying as soon as he had finished his last bit, "Oh, come now, Peter," and off they went. All the way, Heidi had a great deal to tell her companion about Schwanli and Barley, and how they would not eat in their stalls on the first day and made no sound, and how she had asked her grandfather the reason, and he had replied that they felt as she did when... There he's eating. She went to Frankfurt, for they had never come down from the elm before in all their lives. And Heidi said, "Peter, you ought to know just once what that dreadful feeling is." The two children had now almost reached the cottage, and Peter had not spoken a word. He was so absorbed in thought that he could not even listen as usual. Now he stood still and said a little crossly, "I would rather go to school than get from the uncle what he promised me," said Heidi. And Heidi, being of the same opinion, strengthened Peter in his resolution. They found Peter's mother sitting alone with her mending. Let's get back to the chalkboard a little bit. The grandmother had to be in bed all day. It was too cold for her, and she was otherwise far from well. This was new to Heidi, who had always found her old friend seated in the corner at her spinning wheel. She ran quickly to the bedroom where the grandmother lay in her narrow bed with its thin coverlet wrapped closely in the gray shawl. "God be thanked and praised," said the blind woman as she heard Heidi's bounding step on the floor. Ever since Peter had told her of the old gentleman from Frankfurt who had been every day up to the elm and often to the pasture with Heidi, she had felt anxious lest he should be able to persuade the child to return with him, and even after he had left, she still feared that some messenger would come and deprive her of her treasure. Heidi stood by the bedside now, asking anxiously, "Are you very ill, grandmother?" "No, no, child. The cold has got into my bones a little, that is all." And she stroked the child's cheek lovingly. "Shall you be quite well then when the weather is warm again?" asked Heidi. "Oh yes, sooner than that, I hope. Please God that I get to my spinning before long. I meant to have tried today. Tomorrow shall get at it," said the grandmother confidently, for she saw that Heidi was frightened. Her words had the desired effect. Heidi sat silent for a while and then said, "Grandmother, in Frankfurt they wear their shawls only to go walking. Did you think they wore them in bed? Don't you see, Heidi, I wear the shawl in bed that I may not be cold. I am so glad I have got it, for the bedclothes are rather thin." "But grandmother," said Heidi again, "at your head it goes down instead of going up. That is not the way a bed should be. I know that, child. I feel it very plainly myself." And the old woman fumbled at the thin little pillow, trying to get a better place for her head upon it. "You see, this was never a thick pillow, and now I have lain on it for so many years, it has got all flattened out." Oh, if I had only asked Clara to give me my bed to bring with me, cried Heidi. It had 3 big, thick pillows, one over the other, and I was always slipping down until I came to the flat part, and then had to pull myself up again where I ought to be. Can you sleep so, grandmother? Yes, indeed, it keeps one warm. And one can breathe far better when one's head is high, replied the grandmother, trying to raise herself into a better position. But we won't talk about it anymore. I have so much to be thankful for that the old sick people are without. The nice soft rolls every day, and this beautiful warm shawl, and your coming as you do to see me, Heidi. Are you going to read me something today? The little girl ran to get the book. She picked out one nice hymn after another, for she knew them all and was glad to read them again. It seemed so long since she had done so. The grandmother lay with folded hands, and her face, which looked worn and troubled before, now assumed a peaceful expression, as if some great happiness had befallen her. Presently, Heidi stopped reading. Are you better now, grandmother? She said. I am well, Heidi. You make me well. Read it through, will you? The child read the hymn to the end, and as she came to the last verse, even though my sight grows dim, brighter still my spirit burns, and I joyful turn to him as a traveler homeward turns. The grandmother repeated it once and again, while on her face there lay, as it were, a great joyful expectation. After a while, the child said, It is getting dark, grandmother. I must go home, but I am so glad that you are better. Holding the child's hand tightly in her own, the grandmother said, Yes, I am glad too. And even if I must keep on lying here, I am well. You cannot know, no one can, how terrible it is to be all alone for many, many days, to hear not a word spoken, and to see nothing, not a single ray of light. Then very heavy thoughts come on one. It seems as if it would never be light again, and as if one could not bear to live, such words as you have just read to me, Heidi, bring light and happiness into one's heart again. Then the grandmother let go the child's hand, and after she had said good night, she ran out quickly, for indeed the night had already come. But outside the moon shone clear in heaven, so that it was bright as day. Peter placed himself on his sled, with Heidi behind him, and like 2 birds through the air, they glided down the elm together. But later, when Heidi lay on her bed of hay behind the stove, warm and comfortable, her thoughts returned again to the poor old blind grandmother, with her thin pillow and her darkness within and without. She wondered how long it might be before she could go again to read to her and kindle the light that alone could help her to bear her loneliness. Long she pondered, seeking for something that would be of use to her old friend. At last it came to her. She knew now what to do, and could hardly wait for the morrow to begin to put her new plan into execution. So wrapped in thought had Heidi been, that she had not yet said the prayer which she never forgot before going to sleep. She prayed now for her grandfather and for the grandmother, and slept thereafter profoundly till break of day. Chapter 19, the winter still continues. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I am here in the classroom. Why? Because I'm the teacher. We are reading the classic story Heidi. I really like it a lot. It's calming for me. I'll see you 4 days off. After 4 days off, I'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks for joining me. We're getting close to our 1,000 videos. All right, that's it. See you Tuesday.